As everybody knows, we're commemorating an incident in Bangkok 35 years ago, which saw two journalists from the club die. It was in the morning of September 9th, 1985, when tanks rolled along the streets of Bangkok and members of the Army's Class 7, a group of colonels known as the Young Turks, staged their second unsuccessful coup attempt in little over 4 years against the government of Prime Minister Prem Tinsulanonda, himself a retired army chief. An army station in the administrative heart of the capital was subjected to heavy calibre machine gun fire and shelling from the tanks, and it pinned down two veteran cameramen, Neil Davis and Bill Latch, who was his American soundman. Davis was killed on the spot by shrapnel, and Latch succumbed very soon after. At least 4 other people were killed that morning when Thailand's flawed and venal politics turned deadly. And I should say that number of 4 is extremely controversial. It's possible that as many as 8 people were killed in the radio station, and any number of civilians were wounded as far away as Nonthaburi in the wild firing. Anyway, the government was able to put down the rising in a matter of hours, but nobody has ever been held accountable for the killings. Davis was one of the most experienced cameramen to emerge from the Vietnam War and a former FCCT president. Both he and Latch were extremely popular members of the press community. Latch was also a fluent Thai speaker, and he left behind a young family that relocated to the United States. So what we're going to do this evening is show a documentary that was made by David Bradbury, who's joined us this evening, after we've spoken with David, and then the program will split, and people who are watching it live will then be able to see the panel discussion that we put together 5 years ago, which was very comprehensive and involved people who were there at the time, journalists, and old friends of Neil Davis, and so you can revisit the whole incident in that way. But initially, we're going to concentrate on Frontline, which was the documentary that David Bradbury made. It was his first documentary. David, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it was your first documentary, and how was it that you came to make it?
Well, I'd been given a grant from the Australian War Memorial of $5,000, which I thought was a princely sum, but I could make probably 2 films with that. And because I'd been rejected in the first intake of Australian Film and TV School in Sydney, I felt that I'd show them anyway. And so I set out to make a film that was about correspondents, photographers, cameramen that had covered the Vietnam War, Indochina in general, and I kept on having everyone that I've met saying, look, your film would not be complete until you interview and have Neil Davis on camera. So I tracked Neil down to where he was then working for NBC in Bangkok, and it was about 1978, and he wrote me back this amazing 2-page manually typed letter to me about my questions about fear of dying and fate and the unknown, what role that played in it, and so on, and the responsibility of the media in covering the Vietnam War or war in general. And he said that he was coming to Australia in about a month or so's time with his then new bride, Julie, and he agreed or said that he would be happy to meet with me. So I met him in the backyard of Tim Bowden, who wrote One Crowded Hour. And Tim had been a friend of Neil's from his days as a ABC radio correspondent. Tim out of Tasmania. They're both obviously fellow Tasmanians, and they're very proud of these Tasmanians, of their heritage of the Apple Island and out of mainstream mainland Australia. So Tim basically, while he cooked, his wife cooked sausages on the barbie, Neil sat down with his brown epaulette safari suit top that he was known for. I realised after the event many years later that Neil was a bit of a standing joke for his garish sense of dress sense and clothes clashing combinations. But anyway, I interviewed him for 50 minutes, 5 rolls of 724/7 16mm film stock, and that provided me with a basis of Frontline, basically, and it was pure gold as I ummed and ahed and asked him to tell me about his stories, his war stories, and that more of that gold went into the finished film, the next 25 rolls of film that I tracked him down to Bangkok and waited for him to get back from a unscheduled trip for NBC when the inroads were being made between Taiwan and China, mainland China, under Mao. Were pretty pissed off with America, and I think it was under Jimmy Carter. Anyway, I basically interviewed Neil in the Rose Garden there in your beloved Bangkok, and I had Mr. Kim, his Korean colleague cameraman, who I borrowed Neil's camera, and Mr. Kim shot it, and I was on the Nagra with Neil's borrowed Nagra tape recorder in the Rose Garden and filmed the interview that then made it into Frontline. I went over to London en route to Bangkok, and Neil kindly sent me back all the dope sheets that he felt that were the best ones that I could get out of the Visnu library. I'd clandestinely photocopied them at their company expense at night time, because they charged me 10 cents a foot for each roll of film that I put through their Steenbeck in the outskirts of London at the time. And Neil saved me a small fortune in actual viewing costs. Then I had to come up with another $15,000, which my father, who was a working class Aussie battler, gave me the money, loaned me the money out of his life savings of 20 grand to pay Visnews for the copyright for the footage that Neil, I with my editor worked out was the best footage to get to finalise Frontline.
Right, and you kicked off as a radio journalist with ABC in 1972. So what took you into making documentaries?
Well,
apart from the award.
I enjoyed my time at the ABC in Sydney, but it was basically chasing fire engines and domestic disputes over the police radio. And I quickly determined that I didn't want to sort of spend the next 10 years at the ABC in radio, because at the time there was an unhealthy war between television within the ABC and like the new kid on the block, and radio. And so if you showed any interest in TV, which I was interested in, it was my generation sort of medium, I guess. I was still in my early 20s, and I wanted to do something with film TV. Every time I got a rare chance to do it, I really liked it. So I got a Rotary Fellowship to the States to study broadcast journalism. And that was 1974, 75. And every night in the backblocks of Middle America in West Virginia, where I was sent on my Rotary Fellowship, I used to get switched between CBS, NBC, and ABC America to see Americans coming to grips with the fact that this was going to be the first war that they were going to lose of that century. And they, oh my God, can't believe this, and that kind of planted the seeds, I guess, for what came out of it later on with Frontline, and deciding to concentrate on Neil's story and jettisoning all the other interviews I'd done with other Australian cameramen or photographers. Most of them had spent just a short time, a couple of weeks, a month at most, in the back blocks of Vietnam and 5 o'clock follies, etc. But Neil was the quintessential cameraman correspondent. And I just, on hindsight, I realised that I was lucky to have Neil as my mentor, because I'd been up to New Guinea, to the north of Australia, which had just been under about 10 years of Indonesian control on the west side of it, what would have been formerly Dutch New Guinea. And I snuck across the border into Irian Jaya, which the Indonesians were dropping napalm on, and innocent villagers in their attempts to basically repress the Free Papua movement of the West Papuans. And I did a story about that, got malaria from my troubles and staggered out of the jungles of New Guinea to Australia and got followed by ASIO and the spooks and all that sort of stuff. And I realised that I wasn't bulletproof at 26, and I realised I could actually die. And so Neil came along just at the right time a year or so later after that, and I basically was so fortunate to have him as a mentor to teach me the tricks of the trade. And then Wilfred Burchett kind of complemented that when I made Public Enemy #1 a couple of years after that, and we were ambushed in Cambodia, coming back to Phnom Penh from Battambang one late afternoon. And that kind of begun my love affair with being a wannabe war correspondent. And then I met Graham Greene, the famous English novelist, who said that he would do a film made about him as a third trilogy or troika, but he would be open to going to South America with me, and suggested I check out Nicaragua, which I did. And Omar Torrijos, who we were going to make a film about, the benevolent left-wing dictator of, or good guy, strongman, military strongman of Panama, was tragically killed in a bomb that was placed in his light aircraft over the jungles of Panama. And Graham Greene said he'd lost all interest in his late 80s in South America when his good friend and Omar Torrijos was killed. So I went on to make my film about Thomas Borge, one of the Sandinista founding guerrilla students that was alive, and Nicaraguano Pasaran at the height of the Sandinista Contra CIA war became my third film.
Right. Well, you've made 21 documentaries in your career so far, and Frontline is probably the best known. You mentioned Public Enemy #1 about Wilfred Burchett, who was this very controversial Australian journalist. What does this film mean to you? I know it was nominated for an Academy Award in documentaries, and it did win other awards, and you've won other awards for your other films. But where does this one fit in your personal ranking?
Well, if it's not the favourite, but it probably is. I think for many reasons, there's nothing like being rejected from film school and saying to yourself, well, I'm going to show the bastards anyway. And I was so fortunate that Neil was so patient with me, and he realised pretty early in the piece, as I travelled around with him for the couple of weeks I was in Thailand, and went down to Aranya Pratet just at the time when the Khmer Rouge were streaming across the border into Thailand, fleeing the invading Vietnamese army that did all the dirty work that the rest of the world and the Americans weren't prepared to do in cleaning up the Khmer Rouge and freeing Cambodia from that. I realised that Neil was, such a good person to fall into the company of. And as I hinted at in my previous answer, came at a time when I really desperately needed a mentor, someone that could teach me the tricks of the trade. And at the end of the day, as Neil will be the first to say, it ultimately comes down to when your time is up, your time is up. And 35 years ago to this day, as we all tragically know, that point arrived at Neil, who'd managed to survive hundreds, if not thousands, of big and small encounters and everything. And that fateful morning, I often wondered, I wish I had the opportunity to ask him, was she there that day? Because he had a saying which I got out of him on the last day that I sat in his room in Bangkok, and he didn't want to talk about it because he quite rightly determined, after I'd tagged along with him for the time of the interviews that I made with him that I probably couldn't understand it, but I was intrigued by this concept that death is a lady. And I often wondered whether she turned up that morning that he and Bill Latch just got their gear and went out to a shitty little radio station in the Armed Forces radio station in the suburbs of Bangkok there to do what he'd done so many other times before in one of many aborted coups that the Thai military had carried out. And that was the day that he tragically lost his life. And so I guess to answer your question, Dominic, it was a very good fortune on my part that I got Neil to be the subject of my first film, and it went on to be nominated, as you said, an Academy Award. And I think it shares a special place in my heart for all the reasons I've kind of said in the lead up to this point.
You said, when we were talking before, you talk about this role that Neil played as a mentor to young journalists like you. You ended up at such a young age with such a successful product, such a successful documentary. But you also mentioned something else that's forgotten, and that is that people shouldn't just think of him as a combat cameraman. He was a correspondent who understood the story in great depth. As you say, he didn't stay at the 5 o'clock follies. He went out, particularly in Cambodia, took enormous risks and was immensely knowledgeable.
Yes, and there's a good story that underlines the meticulous note-taking and diaries that Neil kept in terms of killed in action that the Americans, because they would, as you know, Westmoreland in particular, they judged whether they're winning the war or not and their success in the war, which they fed at the 5 o'clock follies every evening, about how many of the Viet Cong or the NVA, North Vietnamese communists, they'd killed. And that was an obsession by the American military top brass. But Neil would keep a diary of the casualties and the numbers that they claimed were killed and of their own as well. And at one point, Jim Pringle, one of your colleagues there, who knew and loved Neil as many senior correspondents did, said that Wilfred Burchett had been on a mission in the south, I think the Mekong Delta, but with a VC, and Neil had come into that village with the Arvin that, as some of you, you all look like your old Asian hands there at this evening there tonight. So you'd appreciate that Neil particularly loved to go with the Arvin, and that wasn't popular with most of the Western correspondents because the story was what was happening to the American GIs and to a lesser extent his fellow Australian countrymen. In the case of Australian correspondents, the Australian Army Forces. But Neil went with the Arvin because he figured it was their war, and he wanted to sort of cover it from their angle. And he was also a country kid from rural Tassie, so he related more to the country kids from Asia and that than he did to the Americans that were, smoking cigarettes and went out with all the paraphernalia and the smell of aftershave, Old Spice on them, etc., and the toothpaste, which the VC or the NVA could smell in their backpacks from almost a mile away to know that they were coming. Anyway, this particular day, Wilfred had said that it's seen Neil come into Arvin, this village, and he told the VC who were about to ambush the Arvin, don't kill him, he's a good one. And they didn't, they called off the ambush. And Neil basically said later on when Wilfred and he caught up, which was a rare moment because Wilfred, as most of you would know, was with the communist side and didn't touch base too often with the Allied side and so on. But on one moment he said to Neil that, this had taken place, and Neil said, "Oh, bullshit, Wilfred, like that, And Wilfred said, no, it was on such and such a date and such a village. So Neil went back to his diary and checked it out, and lo and behold, sure enough, he was in that village on that particular day, and Wilfred had in fact saved his life. So Yeah, there were many moments of that as you old hands would know, was a great thing. And Tim Page lives just a couple of hours south of me here now in Bellingen, on the north coast of New South Wales. And he was a great mate of Neil Davis, as was Sean Flynn, and the tragedy of Sean Flynn, Errol Flynn's son, that went missing in Cambodia with Dana Stone, the American photographer, as well.
David, you mentioned to me that you're working on 2 other projects at the moment, and that some of them include material from Neil Davis, John Macbeth, other correspondence of that period. Can you tell us a little bit about these projects?
Yeah, I went on a tour with that was organised by the Old Hacks in 2010, and it was throughout the south and to the north, and I kind of wanted to, in honouring Neil, I collected interviews with people like Derek Williams and John Macbeth and Gary Burns, who was next to Neil that tragic morning 35 years ago and never picked up a news camera after that because he was so traumatised by it and the loss of Neil, who, like so many, he loved. And I've interviewed them and to make sure that at least I've got it in the can, so that we're all getting of an age where, you know, the old hands are dying off, or a number of them have gone. So I've tried the ABC in Australia to see if I could get some funding from them, but it's a new breed in the ABC now, and they don't sort of understand or acknowledge the importance of people like Neil Davis and to our war history and to the integrity of journalism and covering in Asia. Australia's become very parochial and very self-centred and kind of still back on the edge of the White Australia policy of 100 years ago almost, you know, under the new brand of politics and the way we run our affairs, you know, scaling back on Radio Australia and so on like that. But anyway, it's one of my desires before I cark it is to do a documentary that brings out the best of the old hands telling their stories about Neil and revisit that in a Neil Davis Redux sort of film. And the advantage of having, you know, 40 years under my belt last year since I made Frontline to revisit that again. I'm also doing a documentary or interview which I've just completed with Hugh Lunn, who was in Vietnam from 67 to the end of the Tet Offensive. Hugh was working for Reuters London, and I think he was about 24 years of age when he went there. And I've just finished a 56-minute documentary about Hugh, which I'd be happy if the Bangkok Foreign Correspondents Club want to get that, to give it out to you to have a screening over there. Because Hugh is very understated, like Neil was, and it's a really good insight about the Vietnam War and how that war was covered in those days by good correspondents like Hugh and Neil. And I'm doing I've done an interview or 2 or 3 with Frank Parmos, who was a journo that was on that mini moke that went down the wrong road in the height of Tet Offensive, and 4 of his colleagues were tragically killed in Chalong district in '68 as well. And Frank has got a pretty interesting history coming from the coup against Sukarno in '65 in Indonesia over to Vietnam when it was sort of really gearing up, and his involvement in Vietnam. So there are plenty of bones for you old hacks and young hacks to chew over in Bangkok. I'd love if and when COVID finally lifts to come over and present 1 or 2 of those films over there at the press club.
Well, it's an open door whenever you want to come. When we talk about news coverage, war coverage today, obviously it's a completely different world. and people tend to infer that the Vietnam era was a golden media age and that nothing approaches it. They tend to forget the risks that freelancers take in places like Syria, which are quite terrifying. I don't think you could make Frontline today, but as a veteran filmmaker, what do you think are the documentaries that do need to be made about the world we live in and the way we go up against each other and fight?
Well, it's a pretty big question, Dominic, to finish on. I think that the tragedy in West Papua that's happening, which the Indonesians, having learnt from previous generations and war correspondents, like you just said, the American military learnt so much from Vietnam War, where journalists, photographers, cameramen could just jump on a chopper and fly into the field and be back in the PX stores and the restaurants and eating American ice cream and big steaks that night, or staying out with the grunts in the field, or the Arvin in the case of Neil, and getting a real picture of what's happening there. I think those days are gone, because the embedding of the of journalists is very much a way that the American military manages to corral the perceptions back home and dominate the public opinion of what wars are worthy of fighting and what aren't. And I can't really see any war that's been worth fighting since the Second World War myself. But I think, what you just said with what's happening in Syria, what's happening in China with the minorities that are being oppressed, the coverage of Hong Kong, which was great until it was squashed by COVID and the new laws that the Chinese regime passed to stop that happening, and so on. It's the tragedy of that. Although we've got more media avenues and outlets than ever, you've got to be able to have people that can get it out and so on like that. So, and the regimes of all around the world are much more astute about controlling the image and the propaganda that comes with that than ever before. So I don't think we lack the will to know it, but the question is what we do with the information after journalists, social media bloggers risk their lives and somehow or other manage to get it out. And then we in the Western world sit comfortably and sitting back watching it on our social media or our big flat screens and everything, and still let the politicians get away with bloody murder and mayhem and so on. So it's a subject for a whole night's discussion rather than just now. But it doesn't. I always take the motto from the first film festival prize that I won that Neil Davis really loved. It was from American Film Festival. It was the Christopher Award, and on the back of the award that I got for it, which Neil loved and I do as well, better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And that's kind of become the motto for the Frontline Film Foundation, which is a foundation or a charity that I started in honour of the integrity of what I'd learnt from Neil and his ilk in pursuing the truth no matter what, and doing your best to get it out as unadulterated and as honestly as you can to the people, and rather than just sitting back cynically and drowning in your beer suds or a joint or whatever like that in the back blocks of Asia or wherever you are, to actually get out and light one candle, because in a very dark world that we have at the moment, we always seem to have had, one candle can make a hell of a difference in lighting up the room and exposing what the powers that be don't want to have exposed, and outing evil for what it is, and the goodness in people as well, that the individual acts of courage and humanity that little people and ordinary people do in the face of outstanding, overwhelming odds.
David, that's a great note to end on. Thank you for being such a tremendous sport. It's getting on towards 11 o'clock where you are in Australia, and we appreciate it. We're going to show in the club now, Frontline. I think you should know that of all the films that have been shown over the years at the FCCT, Frontline is probably neck and neck with one other film, which is Soul of the Nation, a film about the Thai royal family. But anyway, it's always been watched with great reverence here. And you mentioned One Crowded Hour by Tim Bowden, which didn't appear until 1987. So I wouldn't have thought Neil, he may have seen early drafts of it, but he never saw the finished product. So anyway, thank you very much. And when you come here, the door is wide open. Show your documentaries and come and lecture us on what filmmakers should be doing in the 21st century. We'd love it. Thank you.
Well, share the night with all of you there. I can only see the backs of your heads there, but nice to know in spirit that we'll all be quietly honouring Neil and listening to him in what you're about to see. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good.
Okay, so the program will split at this point, and people who are watching it online will have an opportunity to see again the panel discussion that we did in this very spot 5 years ago, and that has probably as good a description of everything relating to Neil Davis and Bill Latch, and Bill Latch gets much more of a showing in that. And in the clubhouse, we will show Frontline one more time. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay, so then we'll just rerun the panel from 5 years ago for those who want to watch it. Everybody else can go up and have a drink on the bar if you've seen it before.